In this presentation, I'd like to shed some light on a growing but neglected population of elders, thus far unexamined in family research. My presentation is about the first research project ever to investigate the growing phenomenon of the alienation of grandparents who have never had contact with their grandchildren. The goal of the project was to examine the lived experiences of grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren as a result of family conflict and parental alienating behaviors. The findings were unexpected and surprising. Grandparent alienation has been defined as the programming of a grandchild by the parent or parents to denigrate the grandparent in an effort to undermine and interfere with the child's relationship with the grandparent. In many ways, grandparent alienation shares many features of parental alienation, but it's also different in many important respects. How did this project come about? Well, in fact, I was invited to do the research by Family Access after making a presentation on the experiences of grandparents who lost contact with their grandchildren. After my presentation, it was pointed out to me that I'd excluded grandparents who've never seen or never had contact with their grandchildren in their first place. I'd focused entirely on grandparents who had had a previous relationship with their grandchildren and then lost contact. As I set out to do this new research, over 100 grandparents volunteered. And in the end, I interviewed 64 grandparents in depth about their experiences. The interviews examined the history of grandparents' relationships with their adult children and children-in-law, antecedents to alienation, alienating behaviors targeted against them, physical and mental health impacts on grandparents, and potential remedies, including strategies for prevention and intervention. The results stood in stark contrast to my previous research on grandparent alienation in cases where grandparents had previously enjoyed a relationship with their grandchildren. In that first project, I found that previously involved grandparents most often lost contact with their grandchildren following the separation or divorce of their adult child. And alienation occurred primarily due to participants' sons or daughters being alienated from their own children. When non-custodial parents are alienated from their children, so too are the grandparents, most of the time. Very often it was non-custodial fathers who lost contact, so paternal grandparents were a group with an elevated risk of alienation. In my new study of grandparents who have never met their grandchildren, it seems that a very different dynamic is in place. Grandparents appear to be at greatest risk of being prevented from having contact with their grandchildren after being previously alienated from their now adult sons and daughters by their former spouses after their own marriages had ended. Parents who are alienated from their children are likely to later become grandparents who are alienated from their grandchildren. These grandparents suffer a double whammy. They simultaneously mourn the loss of their children and their grandchildren from their lives. In many ways, their grief is more pronounced, despite never having seen their grandchildren. Words like trauma, primal wound, and a tragedy of the greatest proportions were some of the terms used by these grandparents, with accompanying severe mental and physical health problems. Grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren focus on the lost time and opportunities with their grandchildren, which can never be restored. Now, this is my first presentation about this new research project. The research results will also be shared within the scientific community and with policymakers and child and family practitioners. I'm preparing a report on the research for Family Access, but I'll also be writing a series of articles on the research in scientific journals for academics, as well as for family policymakers and child and family practitioners. My presentation is in 4 parts. First, I'll provide some background information and introduce you to the core issues respecting grandparents who are alienated from their grandchildren, comparing grandparents who were alienated after having a relationship with their grandchildren with grandparents who have never seen their grandchildren. In the second part of my presentation, I'll present the findings of my new research project on the lived experiences of grandparents who have never seen their grandchildren. Third, I will examine what grandparents themselves have to say about needed strategies for prevention and intervention in cases of grandparent alienation. And finally, I'll present my conclusions regarding strategies for prevention and intervention in cases of grandparent alienation. So I'd like to begin with an overview of core issues respecting grandparents who are alienated from their grandchildren. Grandparent alienation is an under-researched, rapidly growing global problem that has had a devastating impact on the lives of millions of children and grandparents worldwide. Grandparents who are alienated even before the birth of their grandchildren and never see them, to this point, have been completely excluded from research. So at the outset, it's important to note that grandparenting today consists of enormous variations. Whereas most grandparents have had a relationship with their grandchildren, many grandparents today have no contact with their grandkids. The variation in grandparent-grandchild relationships is a function of geographical proximity, age of grandparents, health status, social class, ethnocultural affiliation, and age and gender of grandchildren. There's also a discretionary aspect to these relationships. It's not uncommon for grandparents to involve and attach themselves differentially to grandchildren, using a selective investment strategy that provides them with an opportunity to enact the full complement of grandparenting roles with only some of their grandchildren, or to just one. The role of grandparents in society has undergone a profound shift, to the extent that some grandparents choose to be less active and involved in their grandchildren's lives, while for others, grandparenthood is the most important part of their identity. Grandparents selectively invest in some of their grandchildren, but not others. There are also grandparents who have strong attachments with their grandchildren, but suddenly find that the relationship is terminated. And there are many grandparents who have never even laid eyes on their grandchildren and desperately yearn to see them. As older parents, or rather, as older persons now live longer and remain healthy for a longer period of time, they're more likely to become grandparents and maintain that role for a prolonged period. Many will be grandparents for at least 20 or 30 years. The reciprocal significance of the grandparent-grandchild relationship has become a popular subject for social scientists. Grandparents are described as providing a source of unconditional love and companionship to their grandchildren, acting as emotional buffers and mediators between children and their parents, and being the purveyors of family traditions, providing children with a sense of roots and identity. Indirectly, grandparents are seen as contributing to child development by providing respite care for parents. And at this point, several theories have been applied toward a better understanding of grandparenting today. Family systems theory, for example, has helped to foster a greater appreciation for the complexity of intergenerational relationships. And family counselors and therapists are increasingly including the grandparent generation in multi-generational family therapy and family counseling. Child development theory has concluded that the grandparent-grandchild relationship has the potential for affecting the development of children in a unique and significant way in all areas, physically, mentally, emotionally, morally, and spiritually. Role theory has ascribed multidimensional roles for today's grandparents, that of historian, role model, mentor, nurturer, and so-called great parent, which is something like an ultimate support person in familial crises and transitions. Grandparenting roles can take on added significance during periods of family crisis and transition. During divorce, for example, Grandparents can provide reassurance, continuity, stability, and emotional support at a time when parents may not be as emotionally available to their children, and a sanctuary and a source of support otherwise not available to children. So for many children and grandparents today, the grandparent-grandchild attachment bond is very important. A Canadian study examining the extent of grandparent involvement and its impact during parental divorce found that more than 3/4 of children had actually lived in a grandparent's home during or after the parental separation, and that grandparents play an important role in assisting children's adaptation to the consequences of divorce. Despite the heterogeneity of grandparenting roles, and with grandparents maintaining different kinds of relationships with different grandchildren, for many children and their grandparents today, the grandparent-grandchild attachment bond is very important and an important component of their self-identities and a significant factor in their everyday lives. Despite varying levels of involvement in their grandchildren's lives, grandparents' emotional attachments to their grandchildren generally prevail over other aspects of their lives. Parents are mediators of grandparent-grandchild relationships, so the grandparent-grandchild relationship rests upon the voluntary consent of the parents. And the nature of grandparent-grandchild relationships is largely shaped by the kinds of relationships that exist between grandparents and their adult children and their children-in-law. Grandparent alienation occurs as a result of alienating behaviors on the part of grandparents' adult children and/or children-in-law, which reflect a conflictual relationship between them. The definition of grandparent alienation is as follows. Grandparent alienation is the programming of a grandchild by the parent or parents to denigrate the grandparent in an effort to undermine and interfere with the child's relationship with the grandparent. It does not pertain to those cases where a child has been victimized by abuse and the child is fearful of the grandparent as a result. The two main features of grandparent alienation are the child's unjustified rejection of and refusal of contact with the grandparent, and the parent's abusive strategies to denigrate the grandparent. In the assessment and identification of grandparent alienation, 4 primary factors need to be present. 1, the child refuses contact and expresses hostility or indifference toward the targeted, rejected grandparent. 2, there's an absence of abuse or neglect by the targeted grandparent. These are not grandparents who pose a danger to their grandchildren. 3, there are multiple alienating behaviors by the alienating parent or parents. And 4, there are behavioral manifestations in the child, like denigration of the targeted parent, weak or untrue rationalizations, absence of guilt, borrowed scenarios from the alienating parents, and false statements based on false beliefs. In my research on grandparent alienation, I've noted 2 main trajectories or circumstances that seem to stand out, and 2 groups of grandparents who seem to be at the highest risk. The first circumstance associated with grandparent alienation is parental separation, when one parent is awarded primary custody and the other is relegated to non-custodial status. Grandparents are at high risk of losing contact with grandchildren after parental separation when their child-in-law is the custodial parent and their own child is the non-custodial parent. The second circumstance is grandparent alienation resulting from parental alienation, where alienated children have their own children and deny contact between their children and their alienated parents. Grandparents are at high risk of never having contact with grandchildren after being alienated from their children after separation and divorce. In my previous study of grandparent alienation, I found that for alienated grandparents who had a previous relationship with their grandchildren, alienation mostly occurred after parental separation. And in these cases, 80% of alienated grandparents identified the discouragement of contact by their adult child-in-law after parental separation, usually the mother, as the cause of the alienation. Many grandparents identified more than one method of discouragement of contact, but this was the primary cause. The methods of grandparent alienation included outright denied contact in 80% of cases, more subtle or indirect means which made contact awkward or strained. These are forms of passive aggression, such as not returning phone calls or emails. 50% were in this category. Thirdly, relocation or lack of knowledge of the grandchildren's whereabouts in 30% of cases. And finally, the constraints of highly controlled, restricted, or supervised visits in 20% of cases. Again, in my previous study, I found significant differences between separation-related versus non-separation-related grandparent alienation. In 19 of the 20 parental separation situations where grandparents experienced alienation after parental separation, their adult child was the non-custodial father and the child-in-law was the custodial mother. In contrast, in 9 of 15 non-separation situations where grandparent alienation occurred, their adult child was more likely to be the mother and their child-in-law the father. So in both separation and non-separation grandparent alienation situations, mothers appear to be the primary mediators of the grandparent-grandchild relationship. I'd now like to turn to the second part of my presentation, my new study of grandparents who have never seen their grandchildren. This is a very different group from grandparents who had a previous relationship with their grandchildren. I'd first like to give you a snapshot view of the key findings of the study and then look at each of the findings in more depth. Alienated grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren are a group in acute distress. They're a rapidly growing population, yet they're very isolated. They're a hidden population whose numbers are much higher than we imagine them to be. They're a very different population to grandparents who had a previous relationship with their grandchildren. It's often assumed that grandparents are a monolithic group with similar experiences, but these two groups are in fact very different. Grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren most often were alienated from their child by the alienating parent in childhood. Parents who are alienated from their children are likely to become grandparents who are alienated from their grandchildren. And as I mentioned, these grandparents suffer a double whammy. They simultaneously mourn the loss of their children and their grandchildren in their lives. In many ways, their grief is more pronounced, despite having never seen their grandchildren with severe mental and physical health problems. Grandparents who have never seen their grandchildren focus on the lost time and opportunities that can never be restored. They experience a grief reaction containing all the major elements of a bereavement and a sense of learned helplessness. Many suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, especially as being prevented from seeing their grandchildren triggers memories of being alienated from their own children. Maternal grandparents appear to be at greatest risk of never having contact with grandchildren after being alienated from their now adult daughters or being the victims of family violence when their daughters were children. Although the negative effects on grandparents are profound, grandparents are mostly concerned about the devastating effects on their grandchildren who suffer the effects of grandparent absence and are unaware of their grandparents' love for them. Grandparents are acutely aware of how much grandchildren need their grandparents. They're acutely aware of the lack of support services, not only to children, but also to parents. They don't feel antipathy for their adult children. Rather, they mourn the loss of their adult children as well and see the negative results of parental alienation on their now adult children. And when it comes to seeking legal and therapeutic help, these grandparents are in a double bind: how to establish contact without making things worse for their children and grandchildren. They are thus less likely to use the services of lawyers, therapists, and mediators. I'd now like to look at these findings in a little more depth. First, some demographic information about the study sample. With the urging of Family Access, who informed its members about the study, over 100 grandparents expressed interest in participating in the research study, and I ended up interviewing 64 grandparents in total, either individually or as a couple. The grandparents spanned a wide range from under 50 to over 70 years of age, with half being in their 60s. 59 grandmothers and 8 grandfathers participated, and 2/3 of the sample were currently married. 54% were working and 39% retired from a range of occupational backgrounds. As far as the grandchildren of these grandparents were concerned, there were a total of 105 children who had been alienated from their grandparents, with about an equal number of girls and boys, ranging in age from infancy to young adulthood. A key question I examined in my research was grandparents' views on the causes of their alienation from their grandchildren. The main reason identified for why alienation occurred was this: grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren were first alienated from their own children by their former spouses, and then when these children became adults and had their own children, they in turn alienated their parents from their grandchildren. There's thus intergenerational transmission of alienation, which is one of the most tragic outcomes of parental alienation. Previous research by Amy Baker found that children who were alienated from one of their parents are much more likely to be alienated from their own children when they become parents. That's one form of intergenerational transmission of parental alienation. The other is this new discovery that children who are alienated from one of their parents will grow up and alienate that same parent from their grandchildren. So when they become adults, alienated children both alienate their own parents and are alienated from their own children. As far as causes of alienation are concerned, grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren were most often alienated from their grandchild by their adult child after being alienated from their child by their former co-parent after separation. 24 of 64 grandparents, or 38% of grandparents, were in this category. In other words, parents who are alienated from their children and do not reunite are likely to become grandparents who are alienated from their grandchildren. This shows just how difficult it is to overcome parental alienation. It persists even when alienated adult children have children of their own. Maternal grandparents appear to be at the greatest risk of never having contact with grandchildren after being alienated from their now adult daughters, or being the victims of physical family violence when their daughters were children. Grandparents identified 3 other circumstances: conflict with their child. This is 23 of 64, or 36 of grandparents were in this category. 4 grandparents were alienated after the separation of their adult child, with contact withheld by the custodial parent. And 13, or 20% of grandparents were alienated as a result of the negative influence of their child-in-law. In all of these 4 circumstances, please note the preponderance of daughters and daughters-in-law as culpable in the alienation. In the parental alienation situations, daughters were the alienators 75% of the time. In the conflict with child cases, daughters were the alienators 70% of the time. In the parental separation-related alienation situations, the daughter-in-law was the alienating parent, and the son was the target parent in all cases. And in the negative influence of the child-in-law situations, The daughter-in-law was the alienator in 69% of cases. These were the main causes of grandparent alienation, but digging a little deeper, grandparents identified a few other factors. First, political, ideological, and religious divisions between their adult children and themselves, and the perception of adult children that such value differences are sufficient reasons to sever all contact. And secondly, a culture that promotes the idea of cutting out so-called toxic grandparents and extended family members from one's life. There's a lack of support in Western societies for maintaining family ties. Family relationships are undermined, not supported, within a culture that's highly divided along political and generational lines. Many grandparents cited the negative effects of social media and government policies in this regard. I also examined the alienating behaviors of parents as reported by grandparents. How was contact discouraged between grandparents and their grandchildren? How was it discouraged, prevented, thwarted, preempted? Now, in this table, you can see the alienating behaviors of adult children as well as children-in-law. As far as adult children are concerned, the most common alienating behavior was simply no acknowledgement or complete lack of response. A second alienating behavior was directly blocking from contact via social media or being told to stay away. Then, through threatened legal action or obtained legal documents, such as restraining orders or calling police, or simply by declaring that grandparent contact will affect kids negatively and leaving it at that. The alienating behaviors of children-in-law were similar. Again, the most common alienating behavior was simply no acknowledgement or response. Then direct blocking from contact via social media or being told to stay away. Then controlling or influencing the son's or daughter's actions, or supporting the son or daughter in their campaign of alienation, then through threatened legal action or obtained legal documents. The tactics of alienation in grandparent alienation cases are similar to those in parental alienation cases. The tactics of grandparent alienators include controlling and preempting contact, brainwashing the grandchildren, banning information, rejecting gifts and cards, false allegations against grandparents, denigration of grandparents, secret keeping with both grandparents and grandchildren, emotional manipulation, social media blackout, encouraging disrespect, and threatening correspondence in letters and emails. What are the effects of all of this grandparent alienation on grandparents? Well, the main point I'd make is that alienated grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren suffer this double whammy. They simultaneously mourn the loss of their now adult children and also the absence of their grandchildren from their lives. In many ways, their grief is even more pronounced, despite not having even seen their grandchildren. They use these terms as like trauma, primal wound, tragedy of the greatest proportions, and they report severe mental and physical health problems. Whereas alienated parents tend to cling to the hope of reunification, grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren focus on the lost time and opportunities that they feel can never be restored. And finally, although the negative effects on grandparents are profound, grandparents are particularly concerned about the devastating effects of grandparent alienation on their grandchildren, who suffer the effects of grandparent absence and are unaware of their grandparents' love for them. So here are the categories of effects of grandparent alienation as identified by grandparents themselves in the study. Number one, sadness, pain, longing, missing grandchildren, a profound sense of grief and loss were identified by 30 of the 64 grandparents in the study. Secondly, compromised well-being of grandchildren, especially emotional well-being. identified by 19 grandparents. These were open-ended questions, so these weren't like predetermined categories. Grandparents themselves answered to kind of an open-ended question. Thirdly, not knowing about grandchildren, just knowing nothing about them, just the complete absence, 15 grandparents. Missing daily routines, daily relationships, 14 grandparents mentioned that. Social repercussions were mentioned by 14 grandparents. That is, not being able to share stories and experiences about their grandchildren with their friends and peers. 12 grandparents identified not being able to love their grandchildren, to influence their grandchildren's growth and development. 12 grandparents identified missing special celebrations, birthdays, milestones, achievements. 9 grandparents just mentioned a sense of incompleteness, the loss of the parental role, just feeling isolated, kind of in a void situation. And finally, 6 grandparents mentioned the pain of rejection, a sense of being erased, a sense of being denied having a normal kind of life. And only 2 grandparents didn't identify any effects. Now, here are the categories of physical health effects of grandparent alienation as identified by grandparents themselves in the study. So 10 identified sleep issues, 10 identified body pain and inflammation, 6 identified stomach and digestive issues, 5 identified headaches, especially migraines, 5 identified heart issues, heart pain, 4 high blood pressure, 4 autoimmune problems, 3 fatigue and tiredness, 2 identified panic attacks, and 1 identified weight gain. Here are the categories of mental health effects of grandparent alienation as identified by grandparents themselves in the study. Depression was identified by fully half of the sample. Clinical depression, 32 of 64 grandparents. Secondly, negative thoughts, rumination, suicidal thoughts identified by 18. Anxiety, 16 grandparents. Sadness, 15 grandparents. Sleep issues, 5 grandparents. Stress, 4. Post-traumatic stress disorder identified by 3. Panic attacks, 1. And isolation, 1. The effects of alienation on grandparents were described in vivid detail. Here are some quotes that illustrate the depth and severity of grandparents' reaction. It's affected me mentally, making me feel really down and everything is hopeless. It's affected my confidence. I've beaten myself up about what I did so wrong. I feel ashamed that my family is broken and I haven't been able to fix it. I feel I must be a horrible person for my own son not wanting me in my grandchildren's lives. Allegations made in court were that I was manipulative and mentally ill and not a good role model, which has affected my self-esteem. It's changed my whole mindset of trusting people. It affects every aspect of my life. I avoid social occasions and weddings and funerals as people always ask how my family are, and I know I'll be judged to have done something terrible to not be allowed to see my grandchildren. It's made me question life itself, as though my life has been one big lie. I put 100% into being a wife and mom, and I loved it, and my family loved me. I was proud of the sons we brought up. I feel now like I failed. Being ostracized by people you love is an awful feeling. Another grandparent said, huge grief that seems to not have an end. I feel relieved to learn of the idea of I felt relieved to learn of the idea of ambiguous grief that helped describe my own pain. I was depressed and anxious. Every morning I'd wake up with the shock that this was happening and that there must be a way to resolve this. I knew our son and couldn't believe he could be okay with this. It took a few years before I accepted that this was my life now. Another quote, along with grief counseling after my daughter's death 4 years ago, I have tried to get therapy and help with the alienation issues surrounding my 2 adult sons. I'm depressed and grief-stricken. I struggle to remain happy and social with friends, especially when they talk about their positive experience with their kids and grandkids. It's truly painful without them in my life, and it's become much worse now that I have a grandson who I may never know. I struggle with sadness. It hits me on a regular basis. Everybody talks about their grandchildren, saying how great and wonderful they are, sharing pictures on Facebook. I had no other choice than to learn to manage. It's a constant feeling of being denied a normal and happy part of life. And the denial is inexplicable. It does not make sense. Many of our friends have grandchildren and get to spend time with them. Weekly, there are reminders of people being with their family members and enjoying activities and time together. I have a longing to be part of our grandchildren's lives and tell them some stories of our lives and hear their perspectives. And finally, this grandparent says, I'm a loving and nurturing person, and so is my husband. We did our best with both our daughters and thought we would be an active part of our grandchildren's lives. I don't work and would love to be with them to share holidays, daily experiences, watch movies, care for them when they're sick, and be an active part of their lives. I find it interesting that we have a neighbor who has a daughter that was 6 when she moved in next door and loves coming to our house for a visit, to watch movies, play games. I feel like she's a substitute granddaughter for us, but it only reinforces how much my grandchildren need to be part of our lives. I'd now like to turn to the third part of my presentation, which is grandparents' perspectives on addressing alienation. What did grandparents themselves have to say about needed supports and legal and therapeutic interventions? And the first point I'd make here is that when it comes to seeking legal and therapeutic help, these grandparents are in a double bind. How do they establish contact with their grandchildren without making things worse for their children and grandchildren? So they're much less likely to use the services of lawyers, therapists, and mediators. When I compare the results of this study with my earlier research, grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren are significantly less likely to make use of legal or therapeutic resources. When I asked grandparents about the use of outside resources, this is what they reported. First of all, their use of lawyers. 43 of 64 grandparents did not consult a lawyer. 9 grandparents did and were told that, well, it's really not possible that I can help you. It's really not useful to take any action. A legal suit would not be helpful. 6 grandparents actually filed legal documentation in regards to visitation. 3 said that the lawyer kind of helped with better understanding the situation. 2 grandparents who saw lawyers said they were not helpful, and one just simply said that the lawyer told them it's best just to wait, see how things evolve. Grandparents' use of therapists. 30 of the 64 grandparents did not consult a therapist. 11 said that they did see a therapist who listened to them and helped them cope. They vented, they talked about events that had happened. 10 grandparents said that the therapist basically said, I can't help you. Nothing can be done without your son or daughter being involved, and they weren't interested in being involved in therapy. 7 grandparents said that the therapist told them to continue to reach out, to send gifts and letters. Don't give up. 5 grandparents said the therapist just was not helpful, in fact, made things worse. 3 grandparents said that the therapist attempted to contact their son and daughter unsuccessfully. And 1 grandparent said that the therapist told them to pray, told them about the power of prayer. And one therapist provided medication. And finally, grandparents' use of mediators. So 58 of 64 grandparents did not consult a mediator. 2 of the grandparents who did basically said that the parents of the grandchildren blocked or rejected contact even with the mediator's help. 1 grandparent said that the mediator helped them decide on what actions they could take. 1 grandparent said that the parents stated that the situation was irreversible, damage beyond repair, nothing happened. One said the mediator wasn't helpful, and one said that the mediator told them it's best to wait. So then I asked grandparents, well, what kind of help, if any, would you have found useful that you didn't have in regard to establishing contact with your grandchildren? I wanted to get grandparents' perspectives on needed help. And this is what they identified. Number one, 11 grandparents stated that they needed better legal help. 10 grandparents said that they needed legal and legislative reform, law reform, to protect grandparents. 8 grandparents said they needed multi-generational family therapy focused on reunification. 4 grandparents said they needed help, therapeutic help regarding the alienation. 4 said that they needed personal therapeutic help in regard to their own emotional and mental health. 4 said that family mediation would have been helpful. 3 said that what is needed is cultural change, more public awareness of this problem of alienation, grandparent alienation. 3 said they need that the needed help was actually for their adult child or their child-in-law. 2 identified spiritual counseling. 2 identified the intervention of other family members. 1 said that it would have helped to have found a way of obtaining information about their grandchildren. 1 said the needed help for grandchildren. But these remaining grandparents identified, for example, 10 grandparents identified just a feeling of helplessness, really not knowing what would have helped. And 9 said, well, you just have to be patient. Outside help is not going to help, ever. So you're getting kind of a real sense of learned helplessness. They've gone through the experience of being alienated from their own children in some cases, and now grandchildren that just, have no sense that anything will help. The most common responses in regard to needed help related to legal help and reform. I also asked grandparents about needed changes to the present laws in regard to grandparents' rights of access to their grandchildren. I wanted to get grandparents' perspectives on needed law reforms, and this is what they identified. 36 grandparents identified the need for a legal requirement of grandparent access, not in abuse cases, but in all other cases. 4 grandparents identified grandchildren's legal rights of access to grandparents. 4 identified legally mandatory therapy or mediation. 3 identified laws addressing grandparent alienation. 3 identified legal recognition of denied access as a form of elder abuse or child abuse. 1 stated that there needs to be a legal requirement that grandparents be recognized in parenting plans. 1 identified legal supervision of grandparent-grandchild reunification. 1 identified legal regulation of professionals, and 1 identified affordable legal services. And 2 just simply said the legal system is broken, needs a total overhaul, and 19 just had nothing to say about needed law reforms. Finally, grandparents themselves are the true experts on the experiences of grandparent alienation, and more importantly, how to address the growing problem of grandparent alienation. So I asked grandparents directly, what specific recommendations would you make to address the problem of grandparent-grandchild alienation? These are their main recommendation, which I've grouped under 4 main themes. The 4 main themes are number 1, recommendations related to parental alienation and grandparent alienation. A second theme was legal recommendations. Thirdly, therapeutic recommendations. And 4, moral and spiritual recommendations. So there were several recommendations made under each of these 4 themes. And here are grandparents' main recommendations for addressing grandparent alienation. First, under the theme parental alienation and grandparent alienation, 9 grandparents identified the need for public awareness and education regarding parental alienation and grandparent alienation. Second category, under this theme was professional education regarding parental and grandparent alienation, identified by 9. Thirdly, addressing parental alienation and grandparent alienation as a complex and multifaceted issue, as a social problem, 8 grandparents. 6 grandparents identified family and relationship education, including parent and grandparent alienation. And 1 identified early intervention regarding alienation. Under the theme of legal recommendations, 12 grandparents identified the need for legal grandparent access rights. 7 identified addressing grandparent alienation as a form of family violence. And 4 simply said the legal system is completely broken. Under the theme of therapeutic recommendations, 15 grandparents identified family therapy and social supports for parents and families. 6 identified mediation and non-adversarial methods. 4 identified support for the grandparent adult-child relationships. 4 identified focusing on the best interests of the child and the children's perspective as most important. And 2 stated that family reunification should always be the priority for therapists. And finally, 3 identified moral and spiritual sort of aspects, stating that value differences need to be addressed, value differences between adult children and grandchildren. Well, we need to listen to the voices of grandparents, and these recommendations provide a number of important directions for addressing the problem of grandparent alienation. Grandparent alienation is a complex and multidimensional and multifaceted issue, and simultaneously a public health problem, a social problem with physical, psychological, moral, and spiritual dimensions. So intervention needs to be targeted at all of these different levels. Grandparent alienation affects not only grandparents, but all members of the family system. Grandparents were so highly tuned in to the profound effects of children who were prevented from having a relationship with grandparents and other members of their extended family. Grandparents were also acutely aware of the interrelationship between grandparent alienation and parental alienation, the lack of support services to grandparents and parents alike, and the need for much better support services to children, parents, and grandparents. So here are some quotes from grandparents that provide some examples of their thoughts regarding needed changes for addressing alienation. I think grandparents should think more about their children and the possibility of mending the difficulties between them if that occurs. If the difficulties with their children are mended, then it follows that access to their grandchildren is likely, a win for all. In my circumstance, I would not like to have a relationship with my grandchild if I cannot have a relationship with my daughter. Another grandparent said, I think any grandparent that has an established relationship with their grandchildren should be entitled to continue that relationship, and any denial of access should be the burden of the parent who is denying access to justify a reasonable reason to deny the child and the grandparent. Also, I think arbitrary denial of access due to the parent's perceived problem with the grandparent should be treated as elder and child abuse. Too often, grandparents are blindsided with cutoff from the grandkids without so much as a conversation. And then third grandparent, it is a tragedy of big proportions. Grandparents need to see, or rather, grandchildren need to see their grandparents. But grandparents must at all times not speak negatively of the grandchildren's parents or any other relatives, even if asked by the grandchildren. Family reunification must be a priority, and remove all extended including all extended family members, uncles, aunts, sisters, in-laws, etc., until the relationship between parent and grandparent is stable and there is trust in what the other may say to the children. I believe the grandchildren's parents must not badmouth the grandparent to the grandchildren, as this behavior is highly abusive to grandchildren. The courts need to protect the grandchildren from any relative who poisons their mind regarding other relatives, i.e. grandparents, etc., and vice versa. No bad-mouthing of anyone to grandchildren. I'd now like to turn to the final part of my presentation, my take on needed strategies for prevention and intervention in cases of grandparent alienation. I'll start with prevention. Prevention begins with education, learning about the core elements and dynamics associated with both parental alienation and grandparent alienation. This is a phenomenon which has affected millions of children and families worldwide. The best way to prevent grandparent alienation is to address the problem of parental alienation. Grandparent alienation is often a fallout of parental alienation. In parental separation situations, when the custodial parent alienates the target parent and at the same time the grandparents-in-law, and in non-divorce situations where a grandparent has been alienated from a child who then denies them contact with their grandchildren. The best way to prevent grandparent alienation is to address parental alienation. Prevention of grandparent alienation requires a multifaceted approach involving these elements. Recognition of parental alienation as a form of family violence, warranting a criminal law response. We have ample research demonstrating that parental alienation is a form of psychological child abuse and a form of severe abuse against the other parent. And it should be treated like any other form of family violence. Secondly, recognition of parental alienation as a form of child abuse, warranting a child protection response. Don't just ignore these situations and dismiss them. Well, we can't prove emotional abuse. Why should we get involved as child welfare workers, child protection workers? No, it's having a profound effect on grandchildren. Thirdly, reform of family law in the direction of establishing a legal presumption of shared parenting, because shared parenting, it prevents parental alienation and grandparent alienation. We have ample research on this as well. And finally, treatment. Establishing a network of family support services to assist families in the separation and divorce transition and in other times of crisis, keeping grandchildren's needs and well-being at the forefront. Time and again, the grandparents identified the lack of family support services and the complete sort of absence of any consideration of grandparents when children are in crisis, children and families are in crisis. Finally, in regard to prevention, is the importance of grandparents taking the high road in regard to maintaining good relations with adult children and children-in-law as gatekeepers of grandparent-grandchild relationships. By this, I mean being supportive of both parents in their parental roles, avoiding taking sides in disputes, generally not getting caught up in conflict with either their own adult children or with their children-in-law. The reality is that parents are gatekeepers of grandparent-grandchild relations, and it pays to maintain good relations with both parents. I know it's easier said than done, but it's important to keep this at the forefront. Intervention and support services for grandparents. I'll talk a bit about that. First, whereas professional service providers may be and are of benefit to alienated grandparents, mutual aid self-help groups are vital to grandparents who are feeling isolated and alone. Many are in a state of what I call learned helplessness and recognize that legal and therapeutic agents often are unable to provide the help that grandparents need. But self-help groups can empower grandparents to not give up, to know they're not alone, because they are very isolated, and to validate the vital role they play in the lives of their grandchildren. Second are legal supports. Grandparents do have legal rights, but the extent of these vary from one state to another. Almost no grandparents reported that legal practitioners helped them in any way. At the same time, it's important to keep in mind that grandparent alienation is actually a form of family violence, and family violence is a criminal matter. And if people don't act on that, then that's on them. Grandparents should kind of push that forward. Third are therapeutic resources, including both reunification programs and therapeutic supports and services for grandparents and their grandchildren. As is the case with parental alienation, intervention in cases of grandparent alienation is a very sensitive matter. Reunification efforts should be undertaken with service providers with specialized expertise in parental alienation and grandparent alienation reunification. Sadly, the latter, there are almost no specialists in the area of grandparent alienation, and that really is kind of a sad testament to the state of therapeutic services today. Finally, I'd like to talk about an intervention that is underutilized, but I think holds a lot of promise as an alternative to legal intervention and also to traditional therapeutic intervention in cases of grandparent alienation. And that is multi-generational family mediation aimed at grandparent-grandchild reunification in cases of alienation. But both parties have to be willing to engage in a mediation process. When divorcing parents come into mediation with child custody and access disputes, it's important for mediators to assess the nature of grandparent-grandchild relationships. Where there are established positive bonds, it would be useful to involve family elders in the actual mediation negotiations. Mediators also have an important role to play in the resolution of access disputes between grandparents and parents, regardless of the circumstances surrounding broken contact between grandparents and grandchildren. This is really an untapped area for mediation. Also, courts ordering parents and grandparents into mediation may kind of further that process of mediation as a viable alternative to adversarial means of resolving conflicts. So, what's the way forward? The case for ongoing grandparent involvement in the lives of grandchildren has been made clear in the research literature. First of all, child development experts agree about the importance for the child to maintain meaningful relationships, especially after family crises like separation and divorce. With extended family, especially grandparents, these are beneficial to them. Secondly, grandparents may well be the most important source of support to children and also to parents during times of crisis, like divorce, a time when parents, overwhelmed by the stresses they're facing, are relatively insensitive to their children's emotional needs. Grandparents can be the safety net in the family during divorce and other crises. Grandparent alienation is becoming a widespread phenomenon, yet it remains largely invisible. The actual extent of grandparent alienation, I feel strongly, is very likely to be underreported. The actual level is something that's hard to ascertain. It's because grandparents find it difficult and painful to admit to and to talk about the loss of such an important relationship in their lives. Alienated grandparents don't want to open up those wounds, and they're less likely to make use of traditional legal and therapeutic resources when they're experiencing this agonizing pain. It's actually the responsibility of social institutions like courts, like lawyers, like therapists, child welfare, to support grandparents, who in turn support parents in the fulfillment of their responsibilities to their children's needs, including the need for meaningful caring relationships with their grandparents and extended family. A big part of support to grandparents is just simply to be aware of grandparent alienation as an issue, to develop tools for assessment and frameworks for intervention, and above all else, to not be a bystander as grandparents are erased from their grandchildren's lives. Thanks for your attention.